We begin with justice for a murdered police officer. 30 years later, Officer James Irby was killed in the line of duty back in 1990.
And tomorrow, his killer is set to be executed. Our Grace White has more on the last-minute appeals Carl Wayne Buntion's attorneys are making. Grace?
Attorneys for Carl Wayne Buntion claim he's no longer a threat. He's 78 and the oldest person on Texas death row. But Buntion's latest appeals have been denied, and the family of Officer James Irby told us they're ready to close this chapter.
Carl Wayne Buntion, 78, was executed in Texas on April 21, 2022, becoming the oldest death row inmate to be put to death in the state. Buntion was sentenced to death for murder. He shot a police officer on duty 3 times, once in the head and twice in the back, taking the officer's life. After more than 3 decades living on death row, Buntion's last meal and final words prompted much reflection on belated regret and atonement. His story from a violent childhood to a brutal killer contains a haunting secret about remorse. On a scorching summer afternoon, June 27, 1990, the life of Officer James Irby, 37, was brutally taken. He had simply pulled over a car on a Houston street. Carl Wayne Buntion, a passenger in that vehicle, unexpectedly stepped out and coldly fired a shot into Irby's head, followed by 2 more into his back as the officer lay fallen. He didn't stop there. After killing Irby, Buntion continued to fire at bystanders attempting to carjack vehicles, shooting at another officer, and threatening innocent people with his gun before being apprehended in a nearby building. This extreme act of violence sealed Buntion's fate for the next 32 years. Buntion had once sworn revenge on the police after his twin brother's death. This detail, seemingly a mere casual threat, would become particularly significant as we delve deeper into the psychology of this killer. From that tragic moment, a long and arduous legal journey began leading Buntion from the courtroom to death row, where he would spend the final years of his life. The life of James Irby, a dedicated officer of the Houston Police Department, was an image of a man committed to justice. He spent his entire adult life saving people and helping the community. For Maura Irby, James's wife, accepting the idea of taking another human life was a great challenge, even if it was the man who killed her husband. To her, this was not revenge, but justice. James Irby was a husband, a father, a symbol of protection and safety in the community. His family trusted the legal system, desiring an appropriate sentence for the one who took their loved one. Meanwhile, in another dark corner of life, Carl Wayne Buntion grew up in an environment filled with violence and abuse. His father had once killed a man in front of one of his sons and frequently beat his wife and children. Buntion suffered broken bones from abuse and developed post-traumatic stress disorder from a young age. One of his brothers also served 20 years in prison for another crime. These physical and mental scars from childhood deeply etched into Carl Wayne Buntion, shaping his criminal persona. He began his path of wrongdoing in 1961 with theft and was subsequently convicted of numerous other offenses, such as vandalism and drug possession. Notably, at the time of Officer Irby's murder, Buntion was on parole after serving 13 months for child molestation. The life of James Irby, a law protector, fatefully intersected with the criminal life of Carl Wayne Buntion. But there's a detail about James Irby that even his family didn't know. Carl Wayne Buntion was not an impulsive criminal. His record was a long string of legal violations, starting with a simple theft in 1961 and escalating over the years. He was repeatedly convicted of crimes such as theft, vandalism, and drug possession. Buntion's criminal path showed a repeated pattern of defiance of the law and disregard for human life. When his twin brother Kenneth Buntion was shot and killed by 2 police officers in a shootout in 1971, Carl Wayne Buntion reportedly vowed revenge. He even told a friend that he would rather engage in a shootout with police than go back to prison. This was a clear warning sign of the anti-establishment and violent tendencies latent within him. According to forensic psychologists, individuals who grow up in environments of domestic violence and suffer childhood trauma often tend to develop aggressive behaviors and disregard social norms. The absence of love and healthy upbringing created an individual prone to falling into a life of crime. Bunchon's criminal pattern showed a clear escalation from minor offenses like theft to drug possession, then to child molestation, and finally to murder. These are 5 warning signs everyone should be aware of. 1 is an increasing criminal record. 2 is an increasingly severe tendency towards violence. 3 is hostility towards law enforcement. 4 is a lack of remorse for one's actions, and 5 is a willingness to use violence to achieve one's goals. All were present in Bunchon's record, signaling a potential danger to society. From James Irby's perspective, it was just a normal workday. He pulled over a car, started a conversation with the driver, and suddenly a passenger stepped out. James Irby surely never expected that it would be the last moment of his life, taken unexpectedly and brutally by a stranger with a gun in hand. He felt his life extinguished in the very job he dedicated himself to. For Carl Wayne Buntion, it was an opportunity to fulfill his vow of revenge. He got out of the car without a moment of hesitation, aimed his gun directly at the officer's head. Perhaps in that moment he felt a morbid satisfaction, a twisted justice for his brother's death. After bringing Irby down, he continued to fire at bystanders attempting to carjack a vehicle to escape, demonstrating an absolute disregard for human life and extreme recklessness. He had no intention of being taken alive. Nearby witnesses watched the bloody scene in horror. The gunshot screams and the image of the fallen officer were deeply imprinted in their minds. Some tried to flee while others became targets of the deranged killer. Chaos and fear enveloped the area. For James Irby's family especially, his wife Maura Irby, his death was a tremendous shock and indescribable pain. Their lives changed completely after that fateful afternoon. The pain of loss, the emptiness James left behind, and their fight for justice for him became an inseparable part of their lives for 32 years. Immediately after the horrific murder, a large-scale investigation was launched by the Houston Police Department. Investigators quickly collected evidence at the scene, including shell casings, fingerprints, and witness testimonies. Within hours, Carl Wayne Buntion was apprehended in a nearby building, ending his brief escape. Modern forensic methods were applied, helping to identify the murder weapon and link it to Buntion. Forensic analysis of the bullet wounds and their trajectories provided strong evidence of how Irby was shot. Witness testimonies, though, in a state of panic, helped reconstruct the events in detail. Every piece of evidence from traces at the scene to the bullets found solidified the accusation of Bunchon's premeditated murder. However, investigators at the time did not know that this case would drag on for more than 3 decades in the legal system, and Buntion would become one of the longest-serving death row inmates in Texas history. Fortunately, the pursuit of Carl Wayne Buntion did not escalate into an international manhunt. After murdering Officer James Irby, Buntion desperately tried to escape. He shot at others attempting to carjack vehicles to flee the crime scene. His aggression and desperation made him an immediate threat to anyone on the road. However, thanks to the swift response of the Houston police force, Bunchon's escape was halted in a short time. He was apprehended in a building near the crime scene before he could escape further or commit any more crimes. There are no details suggesting that Buntion had planned an international life on the run or had support from other criminal organizations to cross borders. He was simply a desperate criminal trying to evade capture after his brutal act. Although there were no dramatic, widespread close calls with capture, Bunchon's own attempts to continue committing crimes and point his gun at others after killing Irby demonstrated his extreme danger. He would rather engage in a shootout with police than be sent back to prison, a mindset that made him a deadly threat until he was apprehended. Carl Wayne Bunchon's case quickly went to trial. In 1991, the jury found him guilty of premeditated murder. On January 24, 1991, Buntion was sentenced to death. However, his legal journey was far from over. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals unexpectedly overturned Buntion's death sentence in 2009, forcing the case to be retried. In 2012, Buntion once again appeared in court. At this trial, his brother testified about their violent and traumatic childhood, attempting to provide deeper insight into the circumstances that shaped Buntion. However, despite this testimony, on March 6, 2012, the jury once again sentenced Buntion to death. Legally, Buntion's case involved a crucial principle in American criminal law, the jury's consideration of the defendant's future dangerousness when deciding on the death penalty. In 2020, a three-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit ruled that Buntion's peaceful behavior in prison did not invalidate the accuracy of the original finding of his future dangerousness. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the jury's consideration of this factor. Buntion's lawyers relentlessly appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that his lengthy incarceration over 30 years and deteriorating health made his execution a cruel and unusual punishment. Even Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer expressed concern that Buntion's prolonged confinement raised questions about the constitutionality of the death penalty. However, in October 2021, the Supreme Court rejected Buntion's final appeal. By December 8, 2021, a state protection order request was also denied. On March 30, 2022, Buntion's lawyers continued to file a request with the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles to commute his sentence or grant a 90-day stay of execution. They argued that the original sentence was based on an incorrect prediction of his future dangerousness, and that Buntion's physical condition, sciatic nerve pain sometimes requiring a wheelchair, would prevent him from harming anyone if released. They also requested a stay of execution to ensure Buntion could access his spiritual advisor during the execution process, based on the Supreme Court's recent decision in Ramirez v. Collier. However, on April 19, 2022, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles unanimously voted to reject all of Buntion's requests. The legal strategies of both sides revolved around proving or disproving Buntion's level of danger, and whether the death penalty was still appropriate for an elderly, long-imprisoned individual. Ultimately, the legal system upheld the original verdict. There is no detailed information about formal letters or confessions Carl Wayne Buntion wrote during his incarceration. However, his final words before his death were a form of confession and an expression of remorse. In an interview just 1 week before his execution, Buntion candidly stated, "Every day for the last 32 years, I have regretted what happened." These words reveal a deep awareness of his crime, something he likely struggled with throughout his long period of solitary confinement. Before the lethal injection, Buntion also clearly stated, "I want the Irby family to know one thing: I am truly sorry for what I did. I pray to God they get closure for their father's and Mrs. Irby's husband's murder." These words, uttered by a man who spent over 3 decades on death row, carry a certain weight. It was not a denial of guilt or justification, but a direct and sincere apology, albeit a belated one. Regarding the authenticity of these words, it appears Buntion underwent a transformation during his time in prison. Once a member of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, he later found religion and spent time reading the Bible. This transformation may have contributed to the remorse he expressed. However, for the victim's family, especially Maura Irby, that remorse could not erase the pain they endured for 32 years. While regretting that someone had to die, Maura Irby said she did not think of Buntion as a human being, but as an object implying his dehumanization when he committed the crime. Therefore, although Buntion expressed remorse, its credibility and acceptance depend on individual perspectives. For the Irby family, justice was served regardless of what his final words meant. Just 1 week before his fateful day, Carl Wayne Buntion contracted pneumonia, further weakening his body. After treatment and on his way back from the hospital, the vehicle transporting him stopped abruptly, causing his head to hit and injure. These events, though minor, were part of his intense final 24 hours. He spent these hours calmly, even able to give an interview. "Every day for the last 32 years, I have regretted what happened," he said, his voice perhaps carrying both weariness and acceptance of his fate. Buntion's last meal was not specifically detailed, but as is customary, he could request a special meal. However, information indicates that he did not refuse any food or make any special requests. The timing and manner of this meal took place in the silence and strictness of the prison preparing for the final moment. When Buntion was led into the execution chamber, the atmosphere became heavy. Witnesses were present, including the victim's family and media representatives. Buntion's final words echoed in that room. "I want the Irby family to know one thing: I am truly sorry for what I did. I pray to God they get closure for their father's and Mrs. Irby's husband's murder. To all my friends who have been with me all these years, I won't say goodbye, just goodbye. I'm ready to go to heaven, Warden." These words, full of remorse and acceptance, made a strong impression. For those witnessing, it could have been a sincere apology or merely an expression of a desire for peace before death. The execution process was conducted with solemnity and professionalism. A lethal injection of pentobarbital was administered, and Carl Wayne Buntion was pronounced dead at 6:39 p.m. CDT on April 21, 2022. Just outside the Huntsville unit, dozens of motorcyclists, including Houston police officers and retired officers, gathered and revved their engines at the moment of execution. This noise to some was disrespectful, but to others it was an expression of solidarity and honor for the fallen officer. With Buntion's death, the final chapter of this decades-long case closed, bringing closure to the Irby family and an end to a life filled with crime. After Carl Wayne Buntion's execution, he was buried at Captain Joe Bird Cemetery, the final resting place for many deceased inmates. With Buntion's passing, the case of Officer James Irby's murder officially closed legally. Although the case has been resolved, its impact continues to reverberate. Buntion's death at 78 highlighted the issues of the death penalty and the lengthy incarceration of death row inmates in the U.S. It sparked discussions about the humanity of capital punishment, especially for those who are elderly and no longer pose a danger to society. Changes in laws and legal procedures may be considered in the future to address these issues. However, for James Irby's family especially, Maura Irby Buntion's death brought a profound sense of closure and relief. She had spent over 30 years waiting for this day, and the conclusion of the case was a burden lifted. The pain of loss never disappears, but justice had been served. The Carl Wayne Buntion case is no longer a cold case because the perpetrator was convicted and executed. However, it leaves significant questions about the impact of domestic violence on an individual's development, the effectiveness of the criminal justice system in preventing repeat offenses, and the ethics of the death penalty for elderly inmates. These are questions that society still needs to contemplate and seek answers to.